thank you very much for coming along this evening to EcoViews and News. We're going to be looking this evening at this question of after Copenhagen and the kinds of initiatives that need to be taken now that the international meetings have taken place. Many would regard the meetings as a bit of a disappointment, but in many respects, whole new initiatives have begun and are being contemplated now because of what wasn't accomplished. And I want to look at one this evening that I think is very hopeful. In Cyprus, within a month of these meetings in Copenhagen, President of Cyprus has convened a conference, an international conference, to look particularly at the impact of climate change on water issues in the Middle East. And this is the kind of effective action that I think we're going to see more and more of as we go forward. There's actually quite a bit of participation of Mediterranean countries, and in particular Greece and a lot of the circum-Mediterranean countries in the conference itself, and some of them were interviewed. You may have caught the interview of George Papandreou, the socialist prime minister of Greece at the time. He was interviewed by Amy Goodman, who was over there for the full 2 weeks, giving some extraordinary reporting, in fact the best in the English-speaking world. She interviewed him within the center at the Copenhagen headquarters, and it's worth listening a bit to his
.info. As we wrap up now on the issue of global warming, a number of Senate Democrats are urging the White House to give up efforts to pass a bill next year to curb global warming by capping greenhouse gas emissions and setting up a system to trade carbon. Conservative Democrats are pushing to table climate legislation in favor of a jobs bill that would be an easier sell during the 2010 elections. Indiana Democratic Senator Evan Bayh told Politico, quote, "We need to deal with the phenomena of global warming, but I think it's very difficult in the kind of economic circumstances we have right now." And North Dakota Democratic Senator Ken Conrad added, "Climate change in an election year has very poor prospects." Well, the comments came just days after the UN Climate Summit wrapped up in Copenhagen. The talks ended in failure as world leaders couldn't agree to a binding deal to reduce emissions. During the summit, I had a chance to sit down with the Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou. As the head of Greece's Socialist Party, Papandreou became Prime Minister in October after the Socialists trounced the center-right government in national elections, winning 44% of the vote, their largest victory ever. George Papandreou is also the president of Socialist International, a coalition of national socialist parties. I interviewed him inside the Bella Center in Copenhagen. Prime Minister Papandreou, welcome to Democracy Now!
It's nice to be on your program, and I follow it quite often through the internet, and congratulations on what you're doing.
Thank you. The state of the climate negotiations, what is your take on them?
It's a very difficult negotiation, and I think that's one of the first things we have to take away from Copenhagen, is that more and more our planet will be needing cooperation at the highest of level, and this is going to be a question of governance. It's going to be a question of how the UN can be more effective and how we support the United Nations, and of course how we make sure that all parts of the world are well represented and it's more democratic in the way we make our decisions. And I think this is just this is a major development as far as institutions are concerned for humanity. But it just shows that we have it's very difficult. There are different interests. In the end, of course, we all have an interest here to deal with the climate change and see the issue in the long run. But we'll see how we have to share the burden and make this crisis an opportunity.
There's clearly in this 2 weeks a simmering anger of the developing world, particularly of the South, over the major greenhouse gas emitters, the donors. When I asked Vandana Shiva, the Indian environmentalist and scientist, what she thought of the U.S. questioning climate debt, climate reparations, she said, don't call the donors, call them polluters. What do you make of that?
Well, I would agree in many ways that the world that has developed already has a huge responsibility for for where we are right now. At the same time, I will say that we have to get beyond the blame game and take up our responsibilities, and certainly those that are polluting more have a much higher responsibility, and historically so, but also in what they're doing today. But that doesn't mean that, and so that's one part of the story that we need to make sure, and this is absolutely right, we have to help the countries that are poor to be able to move forward. What we have to be able to say is that countries like India have the right to grow, as other countries have grown, have the right to develop, but that in the end, our path, the path of the developed world, and Greece is somewhere, is less of a polluter, but is of course now part of the developed world and polluting quite a bit, and we want to move into a green economy. But in the end, our path is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for us. It's unsustainable for the rest of the world. So we can talk about the past and we can talk about the burden we have, but we also have to talk about where we go from now on.
Okay. Well, this is quite a statement, in effect. It seems to me quite a forward-looking statement. The question is not just a question of blame game, as he said, but we have to think about how we can move forward from now on. And in the Mediterranean area, there's been some very creative thinking about this that I think is worth pursuing. And as I say, within a month, there have been a number of heads of state in the area that have begun to look at this. In effect, they've begun to acknowledge what Einstein said a long time ago: we can't solve the problems we have by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. We've got to kind of think new kinds of ways to approach the coming climate change in such a way that we can actually move beyond this blaming things back and forth. And this raises some very interesting questions in the Middle East that I think historically, of course, if you look at any of the material in the past, we're up against a transition that is really quite important in terms of moving beyond the kinds of states of mind that got us into this circumstance. We can't solve the problems using the same kind of thinking we used to create them, as Einstein underscored. Now, it seems to me, historically, the Middle East and Greece and Cyprus are the crossroads of a lot of ancient thinking on things. Maps used to disorient people as much as orient them. North is actually over here, but the old maps of Egypt wanted to include the whole Middle East, including Cyprus up here, and they did so by changing the orientation of the map. But if you look at these Egypt and Syria early maps, you begin to realize that some of the key crossroad places are right there in the middle of the Mediterranean, and Cyprus is the key crossroads between east, west, north, and south, between Egypt and Turkey, and the large centers of power in the past. When Europeans took a look at the way ancient civilizations organized themselves and how they created their civilizations off the flow of water, they focused a lot upon the hydrology of ancient Egypt and the like. And they also focused on the coastal areas. Now, these same regions are coming into focus now in the Middle East because of the changing climate. And it's Cyprus that has become the kind of center point for discussing a lot of the climate change in the entire circum-Mediterranean area. They're, in a sense, in a crossroads of another kind of transformation. These trend transformations that are occurring. Global oil is peaking. Population is continuing to grow, and planetary temperature is increasing. Now, if you follow this as a concomitance of trends, it's really quite disorienting in some respects, because what we have is a huge set of problems converging at the same time in the latter part of the 20th century, the early part of the 21st century. Each one of these years represents 25-year grid, and 1925, 1950, 1975, the year 2000 over here on the right. And what we're getting is the peaking of oil production, the growth of population, and the increase of planetary temperature, all at the same time. So the convergence of a crisis shortly after the new century, where climate change is driving these other kinds of circumstances, and people have to, in effect, confront new circumstances with old maps. That's what we want to start looking at today, and take some courage from the way in which Cyprus, it seems to me, has recognized this problem. Even in the local newspapers, it comes out from time to time. Cyprus has said it's a time for tightening belts. People showing no awareness, according to this article, that the world situation is going to need to change habits. And this particular article focused on Cyprus, and Cypriots may need to start bracing themselves for lifestyle changes if oil prices continue to skyrocket. Well, they haven't skyrocketed over the last year, but on the same front page, take a look at the other kinds of problems that were highlighted. Water theft claims were brought to the fore. And in fact, if you look at it, you can see that a lot of the local politics has to do in Cyprus with water crises, one way or the other. They've had several years of drought followed by a fairly good year of rain this year, but they realize they're up against it, and they realize the truth of what Einstein has pointed out, that we really can't continue to think in the same way. And this is what's behind a very progressive effort here within a month of the global climate meetings in Copenhagen. We have the announcement here and the conduct of an international conference starting tomorrow morning, and tomorrow evening, International Conference on Energy, Water, and Climate Change in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Cyprus Institute is putting this together, and it's going from the 11th to the 15th, starting with a public lecture tomorrow evening under the title, Can We Fix the Climate Problem?, given by Jos Lilieveld, who is from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. This is quite a gathering of international scientists and policymakers, and as they say on their website, in response to the Copenhagen Climate Accord, the conference brings together Cyprus distinguished scholars, scientists, policymakers, and high-level officials from the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East to discuss and present the emerging challenges posed by the climate change in the Mediterranean. They have a very accessible website, and it's worth looking at it in detail. It's also worth noting that it's under the patronage of the President of the Republic, His Excellency Dimitris Christofias. This is at the highest level in that country. This is not just a gathering of scientists and policy people to hash over theoretical papers. This is at the highest level, being supported by the President of the country. They published the program of their conference, and you can actually take a look at it. It's very instructive, very helpful. Just the enumeration of the papers that are going to be presented and discussed in the next few days is worth it as a beginning effort to look at some of the crises emerging. Let's see if we can zero in on a few of them. Well, first of all, there's going to be an introduction by pretty high-level political figures, including the Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources, or a representative from the ministry, and the Undersecretary to the President himself will be presenting these material in that opening lecture in the evening by Jos Lilieveld, who's going to be talking on can we fix the climate problem. But throughout the next several days, an enormous number of papers are being presented, including topics like climate change and water resources. Other ones include climate change and health policies in the Mediterranean. Now, this is a matter of immediate concern because very quickly, when climate issues become water issues, they become public health issues very, very quickly. And it's worth realizing here that a number of people are contributing to this, including extended discussions on climate policies in the Mediterranean after Copenhagen. And again, a paper here being presented by Richard Cooper from Harvard on after Copenhagen evaluation, critique, and next steps. All of this is being put together in a way that should be pretty accessible internationally. That is to say, it's actually being carried by CYTA and locally, and they may even, if they're prevailed upon, have a website that would stream some of these papers to the world. Now that they're going to be following the international or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Third Assessment Report, which back in 2001 emphasized the problems that we're up against here in the Middle East. Increasing global surface temperatures are very likely to lead to changes in precipitation and atmospheric moisture because of changes in atmospheric circulation and a more active hydrological cycle. That's what's going to be focused on, I should expect. I don't have any advanced copies of these papers, but one of the projections from the 2001 reports of the IPCC was a more active hydrological cycle and increases in water holding capacity throughout the atmosphere. Atmospheric water vapor is also a climatically critical greenhouse gas and an important chemical constituent in the troposphere and stratosphere. The IPCC went on to point out that current climate models simulate a climate change-induced increase in annual precipitation in high and mid-latitudes and most equatorial regions, but a general decrease in the subtropics. Now this is crucial for the Middle East. If you go on and read this in detail, you can see that what's involved here is the projection. In 2001, this is almost a decade ago now, the scientists were saying that they expect a decrease of precipitation in the subtropics along large parts of the world. Changes associated with global warming are small compared to those resulting from natural multi-decade variability, even by the 2080s, but changes in seasonal precipitation are going to be crucial. In general, they point out the largest percentage precipitation changes over land are found in high latitudes, some equatorial regions, and Southeast Asia, although the models differ from time to time. Now, those models have been brought up to date, and a lot more study has been done more recently on the Middle East. What's becoming apparent is that in addition to physical impacts, there's going to be substantial social impact as people are moving in reference to changed precipitation. A study came out last year called Rising Temperatures, Rising Tensions, Climate Change and the Risk of Violent Conflict in the Middle East. It's not clear that the conference starting tomorrow is going to focus on the socioeconomic aspects of climate. They're going to focus initially on the known data collected in the last few years since the IPCC 2001 and 2007 synthesis reports. But for a number of years, people like Lester Brown have been pointing out that we need a plan B and that we've got to, in effect, learn how to cope with climate variation in places like the Middle East, where rising tensions could emerge from rising temperatures very quickly. After all, this has happened in the past. This is not unknown. In fact, large civilizations have collapsed. If you recall the work of the Yale archaeologist Harvey Weiss in northern Syria, you probably realize from the New York Times articles about it, as long ago as the early 1990s, that large civilizations can and did collapse as prolonged drought set in. Well, why are we worried about prolonged drought? In part because it's already started. If you listen to current reports on this, you'll be quite concerned. Take a look at what NPR recently revealed about some of this. It's actually pretty disturbing in many respects because it's a trend that's already underway. It's not something that's theoretical or could happen. It's already started in many respects. and it needs to be sort of monitored much more closely. The impacts of it are quite staggering, and that's why Cyprus is looking
From
into it.
NPR News, it's All Things Considered. I'm Michelle Norris.
And I'm Melissa Block. In the Middle East, oil was the resource that defined the last century. Water and its scarcity may define this one. The Middle East is facing the worst water crisis in many decades. For 3 summers, the annual rains have failed to come. We have the first story now in a 2-part series on water in the Middle East and the phenomenon of water refugees. NPR's Deborah Amos begins her report in Syria.
This winter rain barely settles on the hard, cracked farmland in northern Syria. There was a time when these fields were green, but the summer droughts have taken a toll. Driving further east is the Badia, a vast rangeland where thousands of people tend herds of sheep. Adame is a traditional village. The houses are white domes of baked clay. This summer, Adame was completely abandoned during the driest months. There was no water and too much sand. It got into everything, even the kitchen, says Nofat Hamid.
Sand got in your kitchen?
Yeah, it was crazy. The sand was everywhere this summer, she says. Life has never been easy here, but Ismar Muhammad, a 43-year-old shepherd who's wrapped in a black wool robe against the cold, says he was wealthy by local standards. He owns the largest herd. He had to drive his flock more than 150 miles for water. With no luck and no grass, he had to buy feed for his sheep.
275 heads.
And did you have to sell some to feed them?
No question, I had to do this, otherwise they would die, and also I need to feed my kids. Before the drought, I'm talking about, I used to have 400 heads.
So at one moment you were actually doing well at this business.
ما في شك لما ما في جفاف وما في شيء يطير يعني الأمور ماشية والحمد لله يعني ماشي الحال. No question, we were doing fine, just except for this drought has affected us very badly.
In Syria, more than 160 villages are abandoned now. According to a United Nations report, 800,000 people have lost their livelihoods. Hundreds of thousands of them walked off once fertile land that turned to dust and pitched tents near the big cities, looking for any kind of work.
Until now, it's an emergency. If we have 2 more years of drought, I'm sure then we can say we do have a crisis.
Syrian economist Nabil Sukar, formerly with the World Bank, now heads a private consulting firm for development and investment. He's been researching the emergency, including its economic and social costs.
I've gone out and I saw some people in the tents. I told them, where are you coming from? How do you manage? They said, we find short-term work, but this is not sustainable.
The mass migration to the cities has created a new community of displaced people across Syria and Iraq.
So yes, water scarcity is forcing people off the land, and therefore these refugees are very much water refugees, or they're a product of water scarcity in the region.
Okay, water refugee, water scarcity in the region. At the same time that in Turkey they're building dams that are controlling the water. It's a very interesting prospect of tension emerging in that area. Now, in Cyprus itself, dams are also being built, but the question is whether the water behind them is going to be regenerated during the rainy season. If there's a secular drought, a long period of drought, the water that comes in one season isn't available for use in the other. Added to that are sea level problems that could express themselves. If you look at these ancient maps, you can tell the delta is very vulnerable to being close to sea level. Cyprus is a kind of crossroads for the study of all of this. You can see from space it has mountain ranges of its own that capture the moisture during the rainy season, and it's from there that it can flow towards the agricultural sectors here in the center of the country. But as they look at it, and as we begin to monitor this material in the Cyprus Climate Workshop each summer in the International Institute for Environment and Public Health, we're going to keep an eye on these issues of climate change and the environment and public health material. The question is whether we can, in effect, invent the new ways to think about this in time to meet a potential crisis that we're going to be up against. Because, in effect, we've got to think outside the box about the ways in which climate can be resolved after Copenhagen.